Okay, so I think we'll start with just saying a few words about ourselves. So for those of you who doesn't know, myself, Tal, from Equitech, from FinTech AV, we're very happy to be part of this this ecosystem, this well, the entire sphere in Israel, this matrix of interaction between really the financial institution and investors and entrepreneurs. It's remarkable to see, and you have to know that this is a model that interests a lot different global ecosystem that want to have like how Israel is focusing on fintech and what they can take for themselves. So you can be very proud of yourself. I mean, Israel is a beacon for fintech, and I see it only evolving further. What we do in Equitech, we're supporting financial institutions in scouting for innovation and digitalization. On the other hand, work with startups on taking them globally to meet like foreign investors and partners. So Adi, please.
So hi everyone. Other than playing soccer, not very well. I am a partner with HF & Co. We represent startups and other high-tech players, also investors, investment banks, so the whole ecosystem. And we have extensive exposure to fintech recently, and all of the GDPR issues surrounding the compliance that the industry faces now. By the way, it's not unique to fintech, and everybody is. Again, I think the host here said it really well. GDP and R. I had a client call me the other day and say, Adi, I'm just back from the Ministry of Internal Affairs. I'm changing the names of my kids to GDP and R. So it's been quite a ride. So happy to be here and happy to have a conversation.
Thank you. First of all, thank you very much, Tal, for hosting me here on this panel. Great pleasure. Secondly, hi everyone. My name is Nir Chervoni, currently acting as the Vice President of Information Security in QuadRax. To those who are not familiar with QuadRax, so QuadRax is an amazing fintech company, which is based in Israel and in Malta. And
we can't talk GDPR anymore, so let's do something fun. And I'm a partner with JVP, one of the Israeli largest venture capital, and actually was co-leading our privacy and cyber investments for the fund.
So we have a lot of content for you and very limited time. So I think we'll jump into it. I'm not sure how if we'll get to all the points that we wanted to discuss, but let's start just in background. How is it that GDPR and PSD2 are affecting Israeli ecosystem, you know, from the financial institution side and the entrepreneur side? So
I'll start.
Go ahead. You're ready.
Okay. So I think, I mean, it's had, as you can see, it's had an extensive, and it's still having an extensive impact. It starts with the obvious, because GDPR has implemented what looks and is an extraterritorial reach to companies outside of Europe who deal with data coming from Europe and from Europeans. And because Israel is a technology exporting country, and our startups, our tech innovators want to sell around the world and use data from around the world and provide services around the world, this has impacted them extensively. I should say, and I think that's kind of obvious, so I want to say the one less obvious point. And the less obvious point is that the inspiration of GDPR, if to give it a positive spin, has made the Googles of the world and the app stores adopt rules that basically make GDPR a global standard in a way. Just taking to, you know, if taking to as an example, the specific new consent rules from Google Play Store. And things of that sort. So it is really, and we can talk about it a little bit more later, but in effectively, it has created a tsunami of the need to comply, and it all of a sudden made this dusty old issue of privacy come to the limelight of a board and say, oh my God, we got this €20 million potential exposure. So it's gotten some, definitely some attention.
I think it can relate also not only to this, but also the financial institutions are not looking at this as a European
Definitely
regulation.
not.
It's a global regulation. If you're not part of it, then you're not part of the startup scene, because they can't work with you and then go to a European-based financial institution because they're not aligned in the regulation.
It's exactly what I said. It's this inspiration thing. The fact that as a service provider, if you of GDPR, but your customers, if you're a B2B provider, service provider, your customers, since they have a responsibility over you as a controller, you'd be the processor, create that ripple effect, and you'd be forced to comply, even though you may have thought maybe I'll shut off Europe, and maybe I'll serve the U.S. only. So in effect, because of the inspiration it has given the private sector has definitely made it a very ubiquitous and global standard.
Nir, what do you think on your point of view as a startup in that group?
By the way, Credirax, from one hand, it's a big startup, but from the other end, it's a small bank or small medium bank.
Yeah, don't be offended by the word startup. It's just.
But I want to refer to the GDPR from the domestic perspective. I think the major thing which happened recently, and when I'm saying recently, it's not only on the last 1 or 2 months when GDPR became enforceable, but I think it's for the last year or year and a half when the awareness with regards to GDPR within Israel and abroad increased dramatically. Because before that, there were some domestic data protection acts within each and every state in Europe, at least almost each and every state, and also in Israel as well. There was the privacy law in Israel, and some of the banks in Israel were aware about it and act accordingly, but it wasn't enforceable. It wasn't with all of the penalties and all of the, I think, the big noise around it. So when I'm looking at Israel, on the Israeli ecosystem on June 2018, I think I can determine that there's a huge awareness with regards to GDPR, to the acting of data protection, to be as much as compliant as organizations can with regards to GDPR. By the way, that's another point which could be a bit complex, because if you can compare it to another regulations which are more granular or at least more deterministic, the GDPR is pretty much vague. So from one hand, we have a new and enforceable regulation to be compliant with, and then that's where the place of the awareness took place. On the other end, it's still very vague, and you can't put a very deterministic acts in order to be compliant, as you can do with HIPAA, with PCI DSS, etc. So if I can conclude this point with regards to GDPR, I think the awareness is the major part which took place recently. If I'm talking about startups, I can tell you that I talked with a couple of entrepreneurs lately, and when I say lately, I'm majorly talking about the last year, and they're asking me as a security professional, what do you think about the GDPR, how it is related to us, what should we do? It mostly came from companies which do AI on health information, or some companies which trying to be a PSD2 kind of a company, to be an intermediate, or if I will use the professional official term, a kind of AISP in the future, in the near future. And everyone is trying to figure what should they do. And I'm buying this with the awareness which I mentioned earlier, because before that, even though there were domestic acts or any kind of regulation, they weren't that popular like today with the GDPR.
I want to say something. Most of the time when we talk about regulation, people for good reason get bored. It's a conversation about Article 1-2, 3, and they got bored. Stop about GDPR. Forget about the clauses of the GDPR. In one of the most important, I think, moments in the digital economy. If you look at GDPR or look at this regulation in a broader perspective, there was an ideological battle between US and Europe. US thought that privacy is not a constitutional right in the US. Privacy is considered to be a property of a person, my information. And the reason that for Americans, if I have a property, I can trade it. It's a contractual issue. And then they build the internet around this notion that that's an asset that one can trade. And we built the internet where the main currency we paid with was our information. We actually lost control over our information in contractual terms. I got to any website and actually waive my right. Europeans for 20 years, for 15 years, were looking shocked. For them, privacy is a core value. For them, privacy is part of my dignity. It's part of my being as a person. And they wanted to actually get the right constitutional values for my right to control my data, to control what's being done with my data, to know who used data to evaluate me, to manipulate me, what is done with my data, who get access to it. So GDPR is actually, it's not articles of law, it's the core values of control over data and control over my identity as the Europeans see it. And now as we see the effect of GDPR, it's not just a question whether one company would have to comply with these rules or with that rules or what would be the penalty. It's actually two continents fighting over the main ideology that would control the internet. The Americans want to keep business as usual. We can monetize data. We can keep actually manipulating people's attention, manipulating people's data for economic benefit. And the Europeans saying, we believe that individuals should have control. And I think if a month ago you were to Vivatech in France, you could see Mark Zuckerberg and the CEO of IBM and the CEO of SAP and the CEO of Oracle, each one of them coming and saying, we actually commit to the values that GDPR represent. So it's not an issue of geographical expansion of the GDPR, it's whether the core values from now on would be that individuals have control over the data. Same applies to actually PSD2 as you'll ask. It's a core understanding that the one who owns the data is the individual. The fact that the bank has data about me doesn't mean that it's the bank's data. It's my data. It's data about me that I should be the one to control the data or to use the data if I want to go to other service provider. So while people try to put it in conflict, it's actually the same logic that's coming from Europe. Individuals have the right to control their data, to control the use of the data, and to control the destiny of the digital life. If you look at it in this perspective, everything that comes later is just applications of these core principles.
Yeah, and I have to say, we're in Israel, we're very good in building these applications to find like the specific. You mentioned, okay, let's look at it on a wider scale, and it's nice to see it, how it, streamed down to the core, to an entrepreneur saying, wow, this is interesting. We can build some sort of engine that will help other financial institutions really deal with the new regulations. Because if they'll have to do it themselves, they'll use manpower, which is costly. So we're finding a sophisticated way to do that either for PSD2 or GDPR. And definitely see that in European countries, when we see the financial institutions, the banks. For example, we were in a delegation to Germany, and we sat there with Berliner Sparkasse, one of the biggest banks in Berlin, and they said, there's no way we're going to touch or even indicate that we have anything to do with the data of our customers. This is entirely their own. We cannot touch it. We cannot use it without their written consent, and more than that, they just stay clear of it because they don't want to get involved in that. So it's a very interesting notion. So you started our discussion towards the PSD2, so maybe you have some, we discussed a little bit about GDPR, but how does PSD2 relate to this, and what's the correlation maybe between them? Because some of them, it seems that, are they competing, are they connecting to one another, is it one after the other? What is the correlation between them?
Well, let's start with the common things which bind them together. So I think Nimrod discussed about it earlier, and he said that now we're going to enter to an era when the user is the one which has the rights on its data, and I think this is one of the key common criteria for both the PSD2 and the GDPR. Still, and having said that, we have a lot of things which are in conflict between them. For instance, you can take the GDPR part when you say, okay, you have two kinds of entities. You have the data controller and the data processor, where in brief, the data controller is the one which defines the purpose of the data to be processed, and the data processor is the one which actually processes the data for the controller. I'm saying that because in PSD2, there is a strict and clear article which discussing about don't have the contractual part between the third-party provider towards the bank, which is in a contradiction with the GDPR. Now, those parts needs to be resolved very soon because the GDPR is discussing about something more comprehensive when it touches the user data, while the PSD2 are more reflecting the financial relations of the user in front of his banks and the intermediates. And in that essence, this must be resolved.
So I think that one of the, it touches on what you just said, because I think one of the underlying principles that is not informing the GDPR but is informing the PSD2 is competition. So it is reminded towards the benefit of data subjects, and I do have I think I do have a dispute with you, Nimrod, on whether that's the main, it should have been or may be the main concern of GDPR, and the Europeans make it seem like that's their concern, but I don't know if it really is. But in any event, looking from both ends of that perspective, looking to the good of the consumer, but from very different angles. So competition is not really, I don't see it as an overarching principle of GDPR, and it is, and it is for the PSD2. So there is a divergence. Also, there's an issue of consent. Consent may be the one thing that could be said about GDPR, how it's potentially less restrictive than it may have looked before, is that consent is not the only basis under GDPR to obtain data.
But Adi, actually, I totally agree with you that the European regulators altogether are concerned not only with private control over data and private individual rights, they're also very much concerned with competition. But if we actually look both GDPR and PSD2, both of them are creating an infrastructure for competition because they understand that the core element which is relevant in our economy is access to data. The fact that banking or financial institutions were actually interfering with competition, that they never let access into their data, which was critical for risk scoring, for lending models, for actually assessment of ability to pay, financial records were keen and they were not providing access. Now the regulation actually said the PSD2, you have to provide access. That's the main principle of PSD2. But if you look at the GDPR, one of the main clauses of GDPR is data portability, which is just the same. It's saying the individual might have data repositories about them in social networks or e-commerce providers, and if they were locked to this provider just because that provider is the only one with access to the data that can actually derive valuable information from the data, it will be anti-competitive behavior. So data portability is, again, just as PSD2, it's a requirement to form